Hi everyone, can you hear me properly at the back? Okay, great. So as Jessica mentioned, I did my PhD from BEE. Technically it's in CALS, but that's a minor detail. So while I was doing my PhD, one of the things I looked at was how rainfall patterns in India have been changing over the last several decades. And that led me to this topic, which is how rainfall and temperature and other climate variables affect agriculture in India. And Prabhu was kind enough to offer me a postdoc, and so here I am. So we all know that climate will affect agriculture, and it does affect agriculture. But the problem when it comes to talking about climate change is that we usually don't have very precise information. Now, policymakers have access to a variety of information sources, but I think this table from the latest IPCC report kind of reflects the issue we face when it comes to planning to adapt to climate change for agriculture. So the first thing you'll notice, I don't know if you can read that very well out back, but the important detail to notice is that often the impact reports or research talk about a very few crops. So it's usually the staples, rice, wheat, and then maybe maize, maybe sorghum, but usually that's where the list ends. And the other problem is that the regions that the reports deal with are often very large. And so what do you do if someone tells you that the rice yields in India are going to decline by 30%? Where should you act? So that's the issue that we are trying to get at here. And what I'm trying to see is whether we can estimate the impacts, the potential impacts due to climate change at a more disaggregated level. So can we figure out from the data we have available what districts to focus on, which crops to be more concerned about, and which climate variables we should be more worried about? Is it rainfall? Is it temperature for a particular crop in a district? And so ideally, we would have a crystal ball, but given that we don't have that, ideally we would have models that replicate how or simulate how plants function in response to soils, to farming practices, to daily or sub-daily environment. And we do have models that do this sort of thing. But the problem is that we don't have them for all the crops that we might be interested in. And we don't have the data in most parts of India to really run these models with enough confidence in their results. So the next best thing are statistical crop models. And what these are usually regressions. If some of you here are economists, and you would know fixed effects models. Those are a kind of model that are used. And they have seasonal temperature and rainfall as predictors of crop yields. And they take into account things that are also time invariant. So certain districts have higher crop yields in general because of better soils or more input use. And they can take into account that sort of thing. So we have done some of that, but I'm not going to be talking too much about those particular crop models, statistical crop models, because this is the issue that we face in India. So ideally, the y-axis over here are the yield departures, so the yields after taking into account the trend in the yields. And the x-axis on the left-hand side is the seasonal mean temperature, and the seasonal mean precipitation is on the right-hand side. Ideally, what we would see is a clear relationship between the yield. You would think that at very high temperatures, you'd see a clear decline in the yield, and maybe you'd see a decline in the yield at particularly low temperatures. This is not so much the case for India. And similarly with precipitation too, you would imagine that the yield of this crop, in this case it's sorghum, has some response to precipitation. But what you find usually is that we are dealing with a cloud of points, and it's difficult to discern a relationship even if there is, you can get a statistically significant value in a regression. But we can still get useful information from these data we have available to answer our questions. So what you find here is that below a certain temperature, you have equal chance of being above or below the average yield in a given year. But once the temperature increases beyond a certain threshold, that's the red line, red vertical line going on the left-hand side, the yields are much more likely to be below average. And we can set a certain risk level. Over here, I've just set an arbitrary level where the yields are 50% more likely to be below average than above. And likewise for rainfall, we can calculate a lower precipitation limit. So then I'm going to skip through this, but because Jessica tells me that I don't have very much time left. But the idea is that once we have these thresholds, we can assume that the temperature and rainfall follow a certain distribution, and look at historical data and future climate projections and see how these probabilities of exceeding those thresholds, or in the case of rainfall, being below that threshold, changes. So what do we see? We see that even for the same crop, different regions will likely require different strategies. So this is, on the left-hand side, you have the area under pearl millet, and there are two major regions which grow pearl millet in India. And you can see that Rajasthan, which is the one that's more north, already faces pretty extreme temperature and rainfall. And in the future, it will have to deal with higher temperatures still, as you can imagine, but might have a little more rainfall. Whereas Maharashtra in the south, it may not be dealing with these extreme rainfalls and temperatures. So the strategies in each of these places to increase or buffer against climate shocks would likely be different. And climate models themselves can have very different projections. So we need to be aware of this when we are planning for the future. So on the top are the best case scenarios for sorghum in this case, and the bottom are the worst case scenarios. So you can see the top shows that there is a relatively small area where that precipitation threshold is going to be breached. And that's one of the climate models. But then there's also a relatively much more pessimistic crop model, which shows that there are many more areas where these thresholds are going to be breached. So we need to be aware of these differences. So we've applied this method to 17 crops so far, for which we have long-term data in India. And these sorts of results and analyses are not supposed to replace more detailed work, including the use of the process-based crop models, as they're called. But they can complement them and help us figure out which are the priorities in terms of the crops, the climate variables, as well as the regions in terms of when we need more research. Our next steps are to look at the effect of short-term climate events. Crops respond to things at a much shorter timescale than seasons. And so we'll be looking into that, as well as the effects of irrigation. I'm a hydrologist by training, so I have to look at that, and fertilizer use as well as high yield varieties. And then extending this to other crops for which we have maybe less data, but still enough to look at. So thank you, and please send me questions or comments at that email address.